He was never supposed to be a warrior. The boy born around 1466 into the royal house of Tenochtitlan was drawn to temples, not battlefields, to the study of omens rather than the taking of captives. In a civilization that celebrated military glory above nearly all else, this made him different, and in his youth, that difference must have been a kind of loneliness. His name was Moctezuma II, and his family had shaped the Aztec world for generations. His father, Axayacatl, ruled as Tlatoani, the supreme authority over an empire stretching across central Mexico. His grandfather, the first Moctezuma, had built that empire through conquests still celebrated in song. The boy's own name meant "he who frowns like a lord," gravity befitting rulers whose decisions affected millions. But names do not determine natures, and young Moctezuma's nature pulled him somewhere else. He grew up in a city unlike any other. Tenochtitlan rose from an island in Lake Texcoco, its canals serving as streets, its causeways reaching across the water to the mainland. The twin pyramids of the Great Temple dominating a skyline that 200,000 people woke to each morning. Other children might have seen this and dreamed of the warriors who kept it powerful. Moctezuma saw the priests ascending those temple steps at dawn, heard their chants carrying across the water, and knew that was where he belonged. At the Calmacac, the school where noble sons trained for leadership, his difference became clearer. The curriculum covered everything, painted books called codices, celestial observation, poetry, military discipline, the histories preserved in songs across generations. Most young nobles leaned toward warfare, imagining the glory of dragging captives up those temple steps. Moctezuma leaned toward the priests who waited at the top. He wanted to understand why the rituals mattered, how the calendars interlocked, what it meant that the gods required such careful attention to keep the world from ending. His instructors noticed. Here was a boy who listened when others grew restless, who asked questions about omens when his peers wanted to practice combat, who seemed to grasp that the ceremonies maintaining cosmic order were not mere tradition, but necessity. They began to see where his path might lead, not to the battlefield, but to the sanctuary. Military training came regardless. No noble could rise without proving courage, so Moctezuma went on the campaigns that empire required. He captured prisoners, enough to satisfy minimum expectations, but there was no fire in it. He performed his duty and returned to what he loved, the quiet of sacred precincts, the patience of watching stars, the knowledge that he was preparing for something that mattered more than war. His father died when he was perhaps 15. An uncle, Tizoc, took power, but proved weak. His reign ended within 5 years, likely by assassination. Then came Ahuitzotl, an uncle of different temperament, aggressive and expansionist, who pushed the empire to its greatest extent. Moctezuma watched these transitions from his place in the temples, rising through the priesthood while warriors rose through conquest. By the time he reached adulthood, he had become high priest of Huitzilopochtli, the war god himself, whose temple crowned the Great Pyramid at Tenochtitlan's heart. This was no minor post. The high priest of Huitzilopochtli performed ceremonies believed essential to the sun's rising, to the empire's survival, to the continuation of existence itself. For the contemplative boy who had always felt out of place among warriors, it was vindication. He had found his purpose. He could serve his people not by taking lives, but by ensuring the rituals that gave those lives meaning. Then Ahuitzotl died, and everything changed. The council of nobles and priests who selected each new Tlatoani considered the candidates from the royal bloodline. They weighed military reputation, religious devotion, political judgment. and they chose the high priest. Moctezuma was perhaps 34 years old. The man who had spent his life avoiding the warrior's path would now command the greatest military power in the Americas. He seems to have understood immediately that he needed to become someone else. He reformed the court, dismissing commoners from palace positions, surrounding himself with nobles whose bloodlines matched the gravity he believed rulership required. He grew remote, solemn, more deeply invested in ritual than ever. But now the rituals served political purposes too, reinforcing his authority, reminding everyone that the Tlatoani was not merely a ruler, but a bridge between human and divine. The boy who had sought quiet found himself at the center of everything. The priest who had wanted only to serve the gods now had to manage tribute networks, military campaigns, diplomatic relations with subject peoples who resented Aztec dominion and watched for any sign of weakness. He had trained his whole life to read the heavens. He had never trained for this. But he was Tlatoani now, and he would learn. For 17 years, he would hold the empire together, balancing the demands of warriors and priests, managing a world whose complexity would have overwhelmed lesser men. He would build temples and renovate palaces, receive tribute from distant provinces, watch the stars for signs of what was coming. The stars, in the end, would fail him. Far beyond the horizons he had spent his life learning to read, forces were gathering that no omen had prepared him to see. The coronation transformed him in ways both visible and invisible. Priests painted his body with sacred pigments. They dressed him in garments no commoner could touch, placed the turquoise diadem on his head, set the gold libre through his lip. Incense rose in plumes around him as he climbed the temple steps he had climbed so many times before. But now, every eye in Tenochtitlan followed his ascent. At the summit, before the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, he offered his own blood to the god he had served as priest and would now serve as king. When he descended, he was Tlatoani. The title meant he who speaks, and it carried weight that few outside the Aztec world could fully comprehend. The Tlatoani did not merely rule, he maintained the relationship between humanity and the divine, ensuring through proper ritual that the sun continued to rise, that the rains came in their season, that the cosmic order his people believed themselves responsible for sustaining did not collapse into chaos. For a man who had spent his life in temples, this burden felt less foreign than it might have to a warrior. But the other responsibilities were new. He had to command armies, though he had never loved war. He had to manage tribute from dozens of subject peoples, balancing extraction against rebellion. He had to navigate the politics of the nobility, rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty, with a precision that would determine whether his reign brought stability or fracture. He had to father children who could succeed him, host ambassadors who came seeking favor, judge disputes that lower courts could not resolve. The contemplative priest now sat at the center of a web whose threads extended to every corner of the known world. His first acts announced what kind of ruler he intended to be. He purged the palace of commoners who had served previous Tlatoani, replacing them with nobles whose bloodlines he considered worthy of proximity to sacred authority. He instituted protocols requiring those who approached him to avert their eyes, to wear humble garments regardless of their actual status, to speak to him only through intermediaries. Where Huitzotl had been accessible, even boisterous, Moctezuma constructed distance. The office was sacred. Those who held it should not be approached as ordinary men. Some saw arrogance in this. Others recognized something else, the instinct of a priest who understood that mystery requires separation, that authority dissolves when familiarity breeds contempt. Moctezuma was building a wall around himself, not because he craved isolation, but because he believed the Tlatoani must be set apart to fulfill his cosmic function. Whether this was wisdom or a fatal miscalculation, only time would reveal. The empire he inherited sprawled across central Mexico and beyond, from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from the arid north to the jungles bordering Maya lands. Dozens of peoples paid tribute: cacao and cotton, gold and jade, feathers and jaguar skins, warriors for sacrifice, laborers for construction. The wealth flowing into Tenochtitlan funded everything: the temples, the palaces, the armies, the priesthoods, the great markets where 60,000 people gathered daily to exchange goods from every corner of Mesoamerica. Managing this system required attention that could easily consume every waking hour. Moctezuma reorganized the tribute networks with the precision of someone who had spent decades observing how systems functioned. He refined collection schedules, clarified obligations, ensured that the flow of goods maintained the capital's needs without provoking the rebellions that excessive demands inevitably sparked. Subject peoples resented Aztec dominion. That was unavoidable, but a wise Tlatoani kept resentment from hardening into revolt. The balance was delicate, enough tribute to demonstrate power, not so much that desperation made resistance seem preferable to submission. The great market at Tlatelolco embodied everything his administration sustained. Each morning, traders spread their wares across a plaza that dwarfed any marketplace in Europe. Obsidian blades sharper than steel, textiles dyed in colors that seemed impossible, chocolate drinks frothing in painted cups, slaves standing quietly awaiting purchase, gold worked into ornaments whose craftsmanship astonished all who saw them. Judges patrolled the aisles settling disputes, ensuring honest weights and measures, maintaining the order that commerce required. The market functioned because the empire functioned, and the empire functioned because its ruler paid attention. Yet for all his administrative diligence, Moctezuma never stopped being a priest. He rose before dawn for rituals, fasted when the calendar demanded, maintained the practices that had defined his life before power found him. His palace contained shrines where he prayed alone, rooms where he consulted with astronomers about celestial movements, chambers where priests brought him reports of omens observed throughout the empire. He listened carefully to all of it. He had spent too long studying the heavens to dismiss what they might be saying. The capital itself seemed to reflect his sense of sacred order. Tenochtitlan spread across its island in geometric precision, canals running straight between neighborhoods, causeways connecting the city to the mainland at cardinal points. The great temple precinct at the center, orienting everything around the axis where heaven and earth met. Gardens floated on the lake's edges, the famous chinampas whose fertility fed the population. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland springs. The whole city was an achievement of engineering so sophisticated that the Spaniards who would later see it struggled to believe human beings had built it. Moctezuma walked these streets and canals as Tlatoani now, though he walked them less often than he once had. His elevation demanded removal from ordinary life. He traveled in litters, surrounded by attendants, preceded by servants who swept the ground before him. The city he had known intimately as a young priest became something he observed from a growing distance, not because he chose estrangement, but because the office he held required it. In the early years, this seemed to work. The empire held, tribute flowed, the rituals were performed correctly, and the world did not end. Moctezuma proved himself a capable administrator, a devoted servant of the gods, a ruler whose seriousness matched the gravity of his responsibilities. If he lacked his predecessor's military glory, he compensated with religious authority that no previous Tlatoani had possessed. The high priest had become the king, and he brought to kingship the sensibility that had made him suited for the temple. But something shadowed these years of apparent success. Those close to him noticed it, a heaviness that went beyond the burdens all rulers carry, a preoccupation with signs and portents that seemed to deepen as the years passed. He consulted his astronomers more frequently. He demanded reports of unusual events from throughout the empire, strange births, unexplained fires, comets, earthquakes, anything that might carry meaning. The priest in him could not stop reading the world for messages, and increasingly the messages troubled him. The omens had not yet become alarming. The forces beyond the horizon had not yet announced themselves. But Moctezuma governed as a man waiting for something, though he could not have said what, or when, or from where it might come. The Tlatoani, who commanded the greatest power in the Americas, spent his nights watching the stars, searching for patterns that might warn him of what lay ahead. The stars, for now, kept their secrets. For 15 years, everything worked. Tribute caravans arrived along the causeways in steady procession, porters bent under bundles of cotton and cacao, feathers and jade, gold dust measured in quills, jaguar pelts and eagle feathers destined for the workshops where artisans transformed raw materials into objects of astonishing beauty. Scribes recorded each delivery on painted bark paper, their brushes tracking the wealth of an empire that seemed in these years to have no limit. The storehouses filled, the temples rose higher, and Moctezuma presided over all of it with the careful attention that had always defined him. He built constantly. New chambers extended the palace complex, their walls painted with scenes of conquest and ceremony, their floors polished until they gleamed. He expanded the aviaries where tropical birds displayed plumage in colors that seemed to belong to another world. Quetzals and macaws, herons and eagles, their calls echoing through gardens where flowers bloomed in arrangements that changed with the seasons. He maintained a collection of animals that astonished all who saw it, jaguars pacing in stone enclosures, wolves and coyotes, snakes coiled in ceramic vessels, even human beings whose unusual bodies, dwarfs and albinos and the deformed, were kept as curiosities that demonstrated the range of creation. The palace itself became a kind of world in miniature. Hundreds of servants attended to its functions, cooks preparing meals that Moctezuma ate alone behind screens, musicians ready to perform at his command, craftsmen working in attached studios, scribes copying documents in rooms filled with the smell of bark paper and pigment. Delegations from subject peoples came and went, bearing tribute and grievances, seeking favor and fearing displeasure. The Tlatoani received them according to protocols he had established, never letting them see his face directly, never letting them forget the distance between their status and his. His days followed rhythms that balanced administration with devotion. Mornings began before dawn, with prayers and offerings at the shrines he maintained within the palace. Then came the business of empire, reports from governors, disputes requiring judgment, military matters demanding attention, even from a ruler who had never loved war. Afternoons often brought consultations with priests and astronomers, conversations about what the heavens revealed and what the calendars required. Evenings meant music, sometimes poetry, occasionally the company of his many wives and the children they had given him. Then sleep, and dreams he reportedly paid close attention to, and dawn again with its rituals and responsibilities. The Tlatelolco market thrived as it had for generations, but under Moctezuma's administration, it reached heights that visitors from distant regions found almost impossible to credit. 60,000 people gathered there daily, buying and selling in a space so vast and so orderly. that the Spaniards who would later see it compared it favorably to anything in Europe. Vendors arranged their goods by category in designated sections. Precious stones here, medicinal herbs there, prepared foods in another quarter, slaves in another. Judges circulated to resolve disputes and punish fraud. Cacao beans served as currency. Their value standardized enough that commerce flowed smoothly among peoples who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, but all recognized Aztec authority. This was what Moctezuma had built, or rather, what he had maintained and refined. The empire itself predated him. His grandfather and great-grandfather had done the conquering, but keeping it together required skills that conquest alone could not provide. Subject peoples had to believe that rebellion meant destruction. They also had to believe that submission brought benefits worth having: access to markets, protection from enemies, participation in a system whose power offered advantages even to those it dominated. Moctezuma managed this balance with the patience of someone who understood that empires survive through legitimacy as much as force. Yet something in him was changing during these years of apparent success. Those who knew him noticed it: a deepening gravity, a withdrawal even from those he had previously trusted, an absorption in religious matters that went beyond what his office required. He fasted more frequently than custom demanded. He spent longer hours in consultation with priests. He ordered reports of unusual events from every corner of the empire: strange lights in the sky, animals behaving oddly, dreams that seemed to carry meaning, births of deformed children, anything that might signal messages from the gods. Some of what he received was ordinary, the random events that occur in any large territory and mean nothing at all. But some of it troubled him. A comet had appeared in 1509, blazing across the sky for nights on end, its tail spreading like fire. The lake around Tenochtitlan had risen without apparent cause, flooding parts of the city. A temple had caught fire and burned despite all efforts to extinguish it, the flames seeming to resist water. Lightning had struck another temple on a cloudless day. A strange bird had been brought to him with a mirror in its head, and when he looked into that mirror, he claimed to see warriors, men he did not recognize, approaching across a plain. Later generations would debate how much of this was real and how much was invented after the fact, projected backward onto these years to make what followed seem fated. The sources are Spanish, or written under Spanish supervision, and they had reasons to portray Moctezuma as paralyzed by omens, a superstitious ruler whose gods had turned against him. But something seems true beneath the layers of interpretation. These were years when the Tlatoani's mind turned increasingly toward the question of what the future held, and whether the careful order he maintained was as stable as it appeared. He had been trained to read signs. The Kalmakak had taught him that the universe communicated with those who knew how to listen, that celestial movements and earthly events carried meanings that proper interpretation could unlock. Now he was receiving messages he could not decipher, warnings whose content remained obscure. The priest in him could not ignore them. The ruler in him could not act on them without understanding what they meant. So he watched, and he waited, and he continued doing what he had always done, maintaining the rituals, managing the empire, ensuring that the cosmic order his people believed themselves responsible for did not collapse. The tribute kept flowing. The temples kept rising. The markets kept bustling with commerce from across Mesoamerica. By every measure available to him, his reign was a success. The Aztec world had never been wealthier, never been more powerful, never been more thoroughly organized under central authority. And yet Moctezuma could not shake the feeling that something was coming. He did not know what. He did not know when. He did not know from where. But the stars seemed troubled to him. The omens seemed ominous, and the careful priest who had become the most powerful ruler in the Americas spent his nights wondering whether the world he had been born to sustain was approaching its end. In 1517, messengers arrived from the Gulf Coast with reports that would begin to answer his questions. Strangers had appeared on the eastern sea, men in floating towers, men with pale skin and hair on their faces, men carrying weapons that flashed like lightning and roared like thunder. They had landed briefly, traded with the coastal peoples, and departed again. No one knew who they were or where they came from. No one knew if they would return. Moctezuma listened to the reports and said little. He sent gifts to the coast, gold and precious feathers, jade and fine textiles, hoping to learn more about these visitors, hoping perhaps to appease whatever power had sent them. Then he returned to his prayers, his consultations, his study of signs whose meanings were finally becoming clear. The forces beyond the horizon had announced themselves at last. The strangers did not return immediately, and in the months that followed their first appearance, Moctezuma found himself suspended between alarm and hope. Perhaps they had been an anomaly, visitors from some unknown land who had come once and would not come again. Perhaps the omens that had troubled him for years pointed to something else entirely, something still hidden that the floating towers and pale men had nothing to do with. He ordered his coastal governors to watch and report, then returned to the business of empire and tried to believe that the world he knew remained intact. It didn't. In 1518, more ships appeared, larger this time, more numerous, carrying men who stayed longer and asked more questions. They traded with the coastal peoples, exchanging glass beads and metal tools for gold that the locals provided partly from curiosity and partly from a desire to see these strangers leave. Reports reached Tenochtitlan describing their weapons, tubes that produced thunder and fire, swords that cut through cotton armor as if it were paper, animals like enormous deer that carried men on their backs. Moctezuma listened to each account, questioned the messengers closely, and understood that whatever these beings were, they possessed power unlike anything his world had encountered. The question that consumed him was the one his training had prepared him to ask. What did it mean? The Aztec universe operated through patterns that proper observation could discern, messages that proper interpretation could decode. Everything signified something. A comet was not merely a comet, but a communication. A temple burning was not merely a fire, but a warning. Strangers arriving from the east, from the direction of the sunrise, from the place where Quetzalcoatl had departed centuries ago, promising to return. This could not be accident. It had to mean something. But what? The old stories offered possibilities he could not ignore. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, had been a god and perhaps also a king in ancient Tula, a figure of learning and civilization who had been driven from his kingdom and had sailed eastward into the sunrise, vowing to return one day to reclaim what was his. The year of his prophesied return, according to some traditions, was one reed, and one reed came every 52 years in the interlocking calendars that governed Aztec time. The next one reed year was 1519. The strangers had appeared just before it. Moctezuma was too intelligent to simply accept that the strangers were gods. The reports described them eating food, defecating, bleeding when wounded, behaving in ways that suggested mortality rather than divinity. But he was also too steeped in his tradition to dismiss the possibility that something supernatural was occurring, that the cosmic order he had spent his life maintaining was entering a transformation whose nature and outcome he could not foresee. He occupied the worst possible position, uncertain enough to be paralyzed, knowledgeable enough to be afraid. He sent emissaries to the coast bearing gifts whose magnificence was meant to accomplish several things at once. Gold worked into intricate forms, feathers arranged into mosaics of startling beauty, jade and turquoise and obsidian, crafted by the finest artisans in Tenochtitlan. These presents announced the wealth and sophistication of the power that sent them. They also tested the strangers' reactions. Would they be satisfied with gifts and depart? Would they reveal their intentions through how they responded? And if they were divine beings, perhaps offerings would appease them, would honor them sufficiently that whatever transformation they brought would spare the Tlatoani and his people. The gifts had precisely the wrong effect. The strangers saw gold and wanted more. They asked questions about where it came from, how much there was, who controlled it. Their interest sharpened rather than diminished. And Moctezuma, receiving reports of their reaction, understood that he had made his kingdom more attractive to men whose desires might prove insatiable. Still, he watched and waited. His whole life had trained him for patience, for observation, for reading situations before acting on them. The priest in him wanted more information, more reports, more analysis, more time to understand what the universe was communicating. The ruler in him knew that action might be necessary, that the strangers could be opposed if he mobilized the military resources his empire possessed. But oppose them how? With what strategy? Based on what understanding of their nature and their goals? He could not act without knowing, and he could not know without more time that the stranger's accelerating approach might not allow. February 1519 brought the arrival that would change everything. A fleet larger than any before appeared on the coast, carrying a man named Hernan Cortez and several hundred soldiers equipped with the weapons previous reports had described. The fire tubes called cannons and arquebuses, the steel swords, the horses, the war dogs trained to attack. Cortez landed near the town the Spaniards would call Veracruz and began doing something no previous visitors had done. He started building. Walls went up. A settlement took shape. These strangers were not merely visiting, they intended to stay. Moctezuma learned all of this through the networks that had always kept him informed about events throughout his empire and beyond. Messengers traveled the roads between the coast and Tenochtitlan, a distance of 200 miles through jungles and over mountains, carrying painted accounts of what the strangers did and how they appeared. The Tlatoani studied these images, men in metal shells, four-legged beasts that seemed to be single creatures, until you looked closely and saw that men rode upon animals, tubes that belched fire and smoke. Nothing in his experience or his training helped him understand what he was seeing. He sent more gifts, more emissaries, more questions disguised as courtesies. He learned that the strangers had burned their ships, deliberately destroyed their means of departure, which meant they were committed now, unable to leave even if they wished to. He learned that they were gathering allies among peoples who resented Aztec dominion, enemies of Tenochtitlan who saw in these newcomers a chance to throw off the tribute obligations they had borne for generations. The Tlaxcalans, who had never submitted to Aztec rule, had fought the strangers fiercely at first, but then joined them, adding thousands of warriors to a force that had seemed too small to matter. This was the news that might have prompted action. An enemy was advancing toward Tenochtitlan, growing stronger with each subject people it turned against Aztec authority. A military response was possible. The Tlatoani could summon armies vastly outnumbering anything Cortez commanded, could block the mountain passes, could overwhelm the invaders before they reached the valley. Moctezuma's generals must have counseled this. His nobles must have urged him to act. The empire had not been built by men who waited passively while enemies approached. But Moctezuma did not act, and explaining why has occupied historians ever since. Perhaps he remained uncertain whether the strangers were divine, unwilling to risk cosmic catastrophe by opposing beings who might be gods or their emissaries. Perhaps he calculated that military resistance would fail against weapons his armies had never faced, that the strangers' alliance with Tlaxcala had already made the military balance uncertain. Perhaps he believed he could negotiate, could learn what these beings wanted, and find some accommodation that preserved his power and his world. Perhaps he simply could not process what was happening quickly enough to formulate a response. The priest-king, who had spent his life reading omens, watched the greatest omen of all approach his capital through the mountains. He sent embassies and gifts, received reports and deliberated, consulted his gods and his advisors. He did everything except the one thing that might have changed history. He did not fight. And so Cortez advanced, his small army growing as it gathered allies, his path leading through the passes and into the valley, toward the lake and the causeways and the city that floated on the water like something from a dream. Moctezuma would meet him there. The man who had never been meant for war would face the force that had come to end his world. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. He chose to receive them with magnificence. Whatever these strangers were, gods, men, emissaries of powers beyond comprehension, they would see Tenochtitlan at its finest and understand the civilization they were approaching. Moctezuma ordered the causeways swept, the temples adorned, the nobles assembled in their most elaborate regalia. If this was the end of something, it would be met with dignity. If it was the beginning of something else, it would be met with the grandeur that the Aztec world had spent 2 centuries accumulating. November 8th, 1519. The morning broke clear over the valley, sunlight catching the lake's surface and the snow on the volcanic peaks that ringed the basin. Cortez and his army, perhaps 400 Spaniards now, along with several thousand Tlaxcalan allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see Tenochtitlan humbled, advanced along the southern causeway, the stone road that stretched across the water toward the island city. They had never seen anything like what lay before them. Towers rising from the lake, canals glittering between white buildings, gardens floating on the water, a metropolis that seemed conjured from fantasy rather than built by human hands. Moctezuma came to meet them partway along the causeway, carried in a litter whose golden frame caught the light, surrounded by nobles in feathered cloaks and jade ornaments, preceded by servants sweeping the ground so that his feet would not touch common earth. He had dressed as Tlatoani, the turquoise diadem, the gold labre, the sandals with golden soles reserved for the ruler alone. If he felt fear, he did not show it. The priest who had spent decades learning to conduct ceremonies without revealing private emotion now conducted the most consequential ceremony of his life. The 2 men faced each other on the causeway, the lake spreading around them, the city rising ahead. Cortez dismounted from his horse, those strange beasts that had so terrified the coastal peoples, and approached on foot. Through interpreters, through the woman called Malintzin, who had become Cortez's voice in the languages of this land, they exchanged words whose meaning would be debated for centuries. Moctezuma reportedly welcomed the strangers as lords returning to a land that was theirs, as guests deserving the hospitality that sacred tradition required. Whether he meant this literally or diplomatically, or whether the words were later twisted to serve Spanish purposes, we cannot know for certain. We know only that he welcomed them when he might have fought them, that he opened his city when he might have closed it, that he made a choice whose consequences would soon become irreversible. He placed a necklace of golden shrimp around Cortez's neck. He received in return a strand of glass beads that the Spaniard must have known were worthless compared to what he was being given. Then Moctezuma led them into Tenochtitlan, into the city his ancestors had built from nothing, on an island that no one else had wanted, into the heart of a world that would not survive the encounter now beginning. The Spaniards entered in a kind of trance. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there and would later write his account of these events, described feeling as though they had stepped into an enchantment, a scene from the romances of chivalry they had grown up reading. The straight streets and orderly canals, the whitewashed buildings and flower-filled gardens, the markets larger than any in Spain, the temples rising in stepped pyramids above everything else. This was not the primitive wilderness they had expected to find. This was civilization on a scale that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Moctezuma housed them in the palace of his father, Axayacatl, a complex large enough to accommodate the entire Spanish force and many of their indigenous allies. He provided food, servants, everything they required. He visited them and received their visits, conversing through Malintzin about matters ranging from theology to politics, each side trying to understand the other across a gulf that translation alone could not bridge. The Spaniards wanted to know about gold, where it came from, how much there was, who controlled the mines. Moctezuma wanted to know who they served, what power had sent them, whether they intended to stay or would eventually depart. He showed them his city. He took them to the great market at Tlatelolco, where they wandered through aisles of merchandise in such variety and quantity that they could scarcely process what they were seeing. He brought them to the summit of the great temple, climbing the steps together until they stood on the platform where the shrines of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc overlook the entire valley. The lake and the causeways, the floating gardens and the distant mountains, the city spread below them like a map of everything the Aztec world had achieved. Cortez reportedly suggested that a cross should be placed here, that a church should replace the shrines. Moctezuma reportedly replied, with quiet firmness, that the strangers should not speak ill of gods who had given his people everything they possessed. This was the tension beneath the hospitality. Two worlds meeting, neither able to comprehend the other fully, both maneuvering for position while maintaining the courtesies that prevented open conflict. Moctezuma was trying to understand what he was dealing with. Were these men or something more? Their weapons were terrifying, but they seemed to covet gold with a hunger that felt very human. Their leader spoke of a distant king and a god who had died on crossed pieces of wood, a faith unlike anything Moctezuma had encountered, demanding not offerings and rituals, but something called conversion that seemed to mean abandoning everything his civilization believed. Nothing about them made sense within the categories his education had provided. For their part, the Spaniards were trying to understand Moctezuma. Here was a ruler who commanded an empire of millions, who could summon armies that vastly outnumbered their small force, who had allowed them into his capital and was treating them as honored guests when he could have destroyed them on the causeway before they ever saw the city. Was he weak? Was he playing some deeper game they couldn't perceive? Was he, perhaps, as bewildered by them as they were by him? Cortez had conquered by boldness so far, by acting as though he had every right to do what he was doing, and trusting that confidence itself would carry him through. But he was inside a city he could not escape easily. surrounded by a population that could overwhelm his men in an hour if Moctezuma gave the order. His position was precarious in ways that the Tlatoani's hospitality only partially concealed. Weeks passed in this strange equilibrium. The Spaniards explored the city, attended ceremonies, received gifts, asked endless questions about gold and governance and religion. Moctezuma continued providing for them, continued meeting with Cortez, continued trying to find some framework within which what was happening made sense. His nobles grew restless. Why were these strangers still here? Why were they being treated as guests rather than enemies? What was the Tlatoani waiting for? The murmurs grew louder, though not yet loud enough to threaten Moctezuma's authority directly. Then something shifted. The sources disagree on exactly what happened and when. But at some point in those first weeks, the relationship between host and guest transformed into something else. Cortez became concerned about his vulnerability, about the possibility that Moctezuma might decide at any moment that hospitality had lasted long enough. The Spanish solution was characteristically bold. They placed the Tlatoani under a form of custody, moving him from his own palace into theirs, surrounding him with guards who were called an honor escort but functioned as jailers. It was done quietly, without violence, framed as a request rather than a command. Moctezuma agreed, or at least did not resist, and historians have wondered ever since why a ruler with his power would submit to such treatment from guests he could have expelled or killed. Perhaps he still believed negotiation could resolve the crisis. Perhaps he calculated that resistance would produce bloodshed, whose outcome was uncertain. Perhaps the part of him that had always been more priest than warrior simply could not formulate a violent response to a situation that violence might only make worse. He went with them, this man who had commanded the greatest empire in the Americas, and from that moment forward, he was a captive in his own city. The world had not ended yet, but it was ending. The rituals continued, the markets operated, the tribute still flowed along the causeways. But the Tlatoani no longer governed. He performed governance, going through motions that had lost their meaning, issuing orders that everyone knew originated with the men who held him. His nobles watched and calculated. His people whispered and wondered. The strangers who had seemed like guests had become something else entirely, and no one knew yet what that transformation would ultimately produce. Moctezuma, confined to quarters that were comfortable but were not his own, had time to contemplate the choices that had brought him here. The omens he had spent years studying had been fulfilled in ways he never imagined. The forces beyond the horizon had arrived, and they were not gods, but something perhaps more dangerous. Men who wanted what he had and possessed the means to take it. The priest king, who had read the stars so carefully, had failed to read the one message that mattered most, and the worst was still to come. The rooms were comfortable. Servants attended him, brought his meals, maintained the rituals of daily life that had structured his existence since childhood. He could receive visitors, consult with priests, issue orders that traveled out into the empire along the same routes they had always traveled. Nothing about his physical circumstances suggested imprisonment. Everything about his actual situation confirmed it. Moctezuma had become a puppet, and everyone knew it. The commands that left his quarters bore his name and carried his authority, but the Spaniards approved them before they went out, and his nobles understood that the Tlatoani no longer spoke for himself. Some of them accepted this with the pragmatism of men who saw no alternative. Others seethed at the humiliation, watching their ruler perform sovereignty while strangers held the strings. The tension in the city grew tighter with each passing week, a pressure building toward release that everyone could feel, but no one yet knew how to direct. He tried to maintain what he could. Through envoys and messengers, he continued managing the tribute system, resolving disputes, attending to the administrative machinery that kept the empire functioning. The motions of governance continued, even as governance itself had been hollowed out. Perhaps he hoped that patience would outlast the crisis, that the strangers would eventually take what they wanted and leave, that some version of the world he had known might survive if he could only keep it running until they departed. Perhaps he had simply stopped believing that any action he took could change what was happening. The Spaniards, for their part, treated him with a courtesy that barely concealed their contempt. They needed him. His authority legitimized their presence. His commands kept the population from rising against them. His cooperation made possible the fiction that they were guests rather than conquerors. But they also saw his submission as confirmation of everything they believed about the people they had come to subjugate, that the natives were weak, that their gods were demons, that their civilization deserved to fall before Spanish arms and Spanish faith. They took his gold and melted it into bars. They demanded more. They spoke of their king across the sea and their god who required conversion. They waited for Moctezuma to deliver what they wanted, while planning for the day when they would no longer need him. Months passed in this suspended state. The rainy season came and went. The festivals that marked the Aztec calendar continued, though now the Spaniards watched them with suspicious eyes, seeing in every ceremony the potential for violence, in every gathering of priests a possible conspiracy. Moctezuma participated in what rituals he could, maintaining his devotion to gods who seemed to have abandoned him, praying in the shrines the strangers had not yet desecrated. The priest in him could not stop being a priest, even now. The rituals still mattered, even if they no longer worked. His nobles came to him with proposals he could not accept. Some urged him to give a signal, one word, and the warriors of Tenochtitlan would rise against the strangers, would overwhelm them by sheer numbers before they could bring their terrible weapons to bear. The city was a trap for the Spaniards as much as it was their prize. The causeways could be cut, the canoes could swarm them on the lake, the streets could become killing grounds where horses and cannons meant nothing. Moctezuma listened and did not give the signal. He knew what such an uprising would cost, how many would die, how uncertain the outcome would be. He also knew, though he could not have said how, that the world was changing in ways that violence could not reverse. Killing these strangers would not unkill the ships that had brought them, would not unburn the knowledge that lands existed beyond the sea, would not undo the alliances they had forged with peoples who hated Aztec rule. Something had ended already. Fighting would only determine the manner of its ending. Spring came, and with it, a new crisis. Word reached Tenochtitlan that more Spaniards had arrived on the coast, not reinforcements for Cortez, but a rival expedition sent to arrest him, to bring him back to Cuba in chains for having exceeded his authority. Cortez had to respond. He gathered most of his men and marched toward the coast, leaving behind a small garrison under a captain named Pedro de Alvarado to hold the city and guard the captive Tlatoani. It was a gamble that revealed how precarious the Spanish position actually was. Their leader gone, their numbers reduced, their hold on the city depending entirely on Moctezuma's continued cooperation and the population's continued restraint. Alvarado was not Cortez. Where the commander had balanced boldness with calculation, his lieutenant possessed only the boldness. He watched the preparations for the festival of Tenochtitlan, one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, honoring Tezcatlipoca with dances and songs that brought together the nobility of Tenochtitlan in their finest regalia. and he saw not worship but conspiracy. The nobles gathering in the temple precinct, the warriors in their ceremonial dress, the drums and the movement and the energy of the celebration. To Alvarado, this looked like preparation for an attack. Whether he truly believed this, or simply saw an opportunity to strike first, the sources do not agree. What happened next is not in dispute. The Spaniards sealed the entrances to the temple courtyard and attacked the celebrants. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Unarmed nobles cut down as they danced, priests killed at their stations. The sacred space turned into a killing ground where Spanish steel met Aztec flesh without resistance. The sources describe blood pooling on the stones, bodies falling across drums that moments before had beaten out the rhythms of worship. When it was over, much of Tenochtitlan's leadership lay dead in the precinct they had come to honor their gods. The city erupted. Whatever restraint had held the population back dissolved in the hours after the massacre. Warriors who had waited for Moctezuma's signal no longer waited. Crowds surrounded the palace where the Spaniards had retreated, cutting off supplies, attacking anyone who ventured out. The causeways became contested ground. The canals filled with canoes carrying fighters who knew these waters as the strangers never could. The trap that Tenochtitlan had always potentially represented for the Spanish snapped shut around Alvarado's diminished garrison. Moctezuma found himself caught between forces he could no longer control. The Spaniards demanded he calm his people, restore order, use his authority to end the uprising they had provoked. His people saw him as complicit in what had happened, a ruler who had allowed strangers into the sacred city and stood by while they murdered its nobility. When he appeared on the rooftop of the palace to address the crowd below, he was addressing a population that had moved beyond his reach. He was no longer their Tlatoani. He was the man who had let this happen. Cortez returned in June, having defeated his Spanish rivals and absorbed their men into his own force. He fought his way back into Tenochtitlan, joining Alvarado's besieged garrison, but his return changed nothing fundamental. The city remained in uprising. The causeways remained cut. The Spanish position remained untenable, and Moctezuma remained what he had become, a captive whose usefulness to his captors was rapidly expiring, whose authority over his own people had evaporated in the blood spilled during Tenochtitlan. He had one more role to play. The Spaniards brought him to the rooftop again, hoping his presence might still calm the crowds, might still buy them time to find a way out of the trap they had made for themselves. Moctezuma stood above the city he had ruled, looking out at the lake and the mountains and the temples, at the civilization he had spent his life serving, and that had now turned against him. Below, his former subjects gathered, their anger directed at the strangers and at the man who had failed to stop them. What happened next would end his story. The manner of his ending remains, like so much about Moctezuma, a matter of interpretation and dispute. But standing on that rooftop, looking out at everything he had lost, he must have known that the world he had been born to sustain was already gone. The omens had been fulfilled, the forces beyond the horizon had arrived, and he, the priest who had never wanted to be a warrior, the reader of stars who had failed to see what was coming, stood at the center of the destruction, waiting for whatever came next. The stones came from the crowd below. That much the sources agree on, projectiles hurled upward at the figure on the rooftop, the man who had been Tlatoani and was now something less, something the people of Tenochtitlan no longer recognized as their own. Whether those stones killed him, or whether the Spaniards ended his life afterward, when they realized he could no longer serve their purposes, remains uncertain. The Spanish accounts say he died from wounds inflicted by his own people. The indigenous accounts, recorded later under Spanish supervision, suggest otherwise. We are left with ambiguity where we might wish for clarity, interpretation where we might wish for fact. What we know is that Moctezuma II died in late June of 1520, probably on the 29th or 30th, roughly 7 months after he had welcomed the strangers onto the causeway and led them into his city. He was approximately 54 years old. He had ruled for 18 years. He had presided over an empire at its zenith and watched it begin to crumble around him. He had tried to understand what was happening through the frameworks his education had provided, and those frameworks had failed him. He had sought to navigate by patience and diplomacy a crisis that perhaps required violence, and by the time violence came, it was too late for it to save anything. His body was returned to his people, or perhaps they recovered it themselves. The accounts differ. What became of his remains afterward, whether he received the funeral rites appropriate to a Tlatoani, or whether the chaos of the following days made such ceremonies impossible, we do not know. He passes out of history in ambiguity, as he had lived his final months in ambiguity, a figure suspended between worlds who belonged fully to neither. The Spaniards could not hold the city. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night they would remember as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, Cortez ordered a retreat across the causeways. The escape became a catastrophe. Aztec warriors attacked from canoes and from the causeway itself, pulling Spaniards into the water, cutting down men burdened by the gold they refused to abandon. Hundreds of Spaniards died. Thousands of their indigenous allies perished. The army that had seemed on the verge of conquering an empire staggered out of Tenochtitlan as a broken remnant, fleeing toward Tlaxcala, where they might find refuge with the allies who still supported them. Tenochtitlan had won, or so it must have seemed in the days after the Spanish retreat. A new Tlatoani was chosen, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, a man who had counseled resistance from the beginning, and who now led a city determined to destroy the strangers who had violated it. Warriors pursued the fleeing Spaniards. Preparations began for the war that would finish what the uprising had started. The empire that Moctezuma had failed to defend would be defended by his successors with the ferocity he had never possessed. But something else had arrived with the strangers, something invisible and more devastating than any weapon they carried. Smallpox spread through Tenochtitlan in the months after the Spanish retreat, killing with an efficiency that made military resistance almost irrelevant. Cuitlahuac himself died of the disease after only 80 days as Tlatoani. The population of the city, which had numbered in the hundreds of thousands, collapsed as the epidemic swept through streets and households that had never encountered this pathogen before. By the time Cortez returned with reinforcements the following year, Tenochtitlan was already dying from within. Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, led the defense. He was young, perhaps 25, and he possessed the warrior spirit that Moctezuma had always lacked. For 80 days, the Aztecs fought with a determination that astonished even the Spaniards, defending their city street by street, canal by canal, temple by temple. The siege was brutal. Cortez destroyed the aqueducts, cutting off fresh water. The floating gardens that had fed the city were ruined. Disease and starvation did what Spanish arms alone might not have accomplished. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured attempting to flee by canoe, and the resistance ended. Tenochtitlan fell, and with it fell a world. The temples were pulled down, their stones used to build churches. The canals were filled in to create streets for a Spanish city that would rise on the ruins. The lake itself would eventually be drained, the valley transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known it before. The civilization that had flourished here for 2 centuries was dismantled so thoroughly that within a few generations it survived only in memory, in the accounts written by survivors and conquerors, in the codices that escaped destruction, in the archaeological fragments that modern excavation would eventually uncover. And Moctezuma, he became a symbol, though of what depended on who was doing the interpreting. To the Spanish, he was evidence of native weakness, a ruler so paralyzed by superstition that he surrendered his empire without a fight. To later generations of Mexicans, he was more complicated, a tragic figure, perhaps, or a cautionary tale about the costs of hesitation, or simply a man overwhelmed by circumstances that no one could have navigated successfully. His name endured, attached to legends that grew stranger as centuries passed, but the man himself receded behind the stories told about him. What remains, when the legends are set aside, is the outline of a life that contained its own kind of coherence. He was born into a world that seemed eternal and was raised to serve it. He found his calling in the temples rather than on the battlefield, and that calling shaped everything that followed. He became ruler when destiny or chance placed him in that position, and he governed with the seriousness of someone who believed that cosmic order depended on proper attention to ritual and duty. When crisis came, he responded as his nature dictated, with observation, with patience, with attempts to understand before acting. These qualities had served him well for most of his life. They failed him at the end. Perhaps no response would have succeeded. The forces that arrived on those ships from beyond the horizon possessed advantages, technological, biological, strategic, that might have overwhelmed any resistance the Aztec world could mount. Perhaps Moctezuma saw this more clearly than his critics acknowledged, understood that the world was changing in ways that fighting could not prevent. Perhaps his passivity was not weakness, but a kind of terrible clarity about what was coming and how little could be done to stop it. We cannot know what he thought in those final months, cannot access the mind that had spent a lifetime reading omens and found itself unable to read the greatest omen of all. The lake is gone now, drained and built over. The Valley of Mexico transformed into one of the largest cities on earth. Where Tenochtitlan once floated, Mexico City sprawls across a landscape that remembers nothing of the water that defined this place for centuries. The temples are ruins buried beneath cathedrals. The causeways are highways. The canals are streets. Almost nothing visible remains of the world Moctezuma knew. But sometimes, in certain lights, you can still sense something, a presence beneath the modern surface, a memory that refuses to disappear entirely. The foundations of the great temples still exist below the Zocalo, uncovered by accident and now partially excavated. The stones that Moctezuma climbed still bearing witness to what once stood here. The mountains that ring the valley are the same mountains that watched over Tenochtitlan in its glory. The sun that rises over them is the same sun that Moctezuma believed his rituals helped to sustain. He was wrong about that, perhaps. The sun continued rising without him, without his prayers, without the ceremonies he devoted his life to performing. The cosmic order he believed himself responsible for maintaining turned out not to require his maintenance at all. But he did not know that, could not have known it, and in his not knowing lies something that might be called tragedy, or might simply be called the human condition. The attempt to find meaning in a universe that does not explain itself, to read signs in events that may signify nothing. to sustain through ritual and devotion a world that will end regardless of what we do. The last emperor of the Aztec world died believing he had failed his gods. Perhaps he had. Or perhaps the gods he served were already departing, making way for transformations that no faithfulness could have prevented. We cannot know. We can only remember him as he was, a man who loved temples more than battlefields, who read the stars and missed what they were saying, who welcomed strangers when he might have fought them, and who watched his world end from a rooftop while stones flew upward from the people he had tried to serve. The lake is gone, the temples are fallen, but somewhere in the memory of this place, Moctezuma still stands on that causeway, dressed in the regalia of a ruler, offering a necklace of golden shrimp to a man he does not understand, choosing courtesy over violence, choosing welcome over war. It was the wrong choice, probably. It was also, in its way, a human choice. The choice of a man who had spent his life seeking to understand rather than to destroy. The waters of Lake Texcoco, which once reflected the pyramids and the mountains and the sky, are gone now. But the sky remains, and the mountains remain, and somewhere in the silence between them, the memory of what was lost here lingers still.